Hi everyone, and I'm Tony Tonkin, and this is the Tony Tonkin Show. Today we've got two very different takes on the same issue, Palestine and Gaza. First, Chris Kenny over at Sky News delivers a furious and frankly morally bankrupt rant against the Australian government for recognising Palestine. Then we'll hear from Peter Beinart on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, a Jewish man confronting the horror of Gaza and what it means for his identity. One is fuelled by denial and outrage, the other is powered by conscience and moral courage. And trust me, you want to stick around for both. All right, let's start with my mate, my buddy, Chris Kenny, because Chris has got an interesting take on all of this. According to him, the government's recognition of Palestine is, and I quote, morally repugnant. He calls Palestine non-existent and insists we're rewarding bloodthirsty terrorists. And this is exactly what Chris has to say here.
There is plenty of fallout and plenty more to say about the Albanese Labor government's morally repugnant and diplomatically reckless decision to recognise the non-existent state of Palestine.
So there's no other way of arguing this. Chris is a terrible, terrible human being, particularly his use of the words morally repugnant and when he refers, particularly later on, to bloodthirsty terrorists. Kelly is one of those commentators on Sky News who you simply wish he'd go away. Now let's look at this and let's rip that apart. First, non-existent Palestine. Tell that to the 140 plus nations that already recognise it. Palestine isn't some fantasy land conjured by diplomats. It's a place with people who've been fighting for their right to self-determination for absolutely decades. Second, rewarding bloodthirsty terrorists. Now, I reckon that that's the most tired, dishonest talking point in the book. Recognition is not endorsement of violence. It's about acknowledging a people's legitimate right to exist and to live free of occupation. Kenny's tactic here is simple. Conflate Hamas with every Palestinian man, woman and child. Erase nuance. Paint them all with the same brush. And that's not journalism. I have to say this, and I'll say it over and over again. That's propaganda. So let's be clear. Recognising Palestine doesn't undermine peace. It's a step towards it. Because without recognition, without equality, peace is impossible. But people like Kenny don't want to talk about why Palestinians live under siege. They don't want to talk about the daily reality, checkpoints, demolished homes, children growing up surrounded by armed soldiers. They'd rather throw words like terrorist around until the audience stops asking questions. But we will never, ever do that. And here's the moral punchline. When Chris Kenny calls recognising Palestine morally repugnant, is saying that granting dignity and legitimacy to an oppressed people is worse than continuing the status quo of oppression and violence. That's not morality. That's moral cowardice. And I will always call it out for exactly what it is. All right, let's step away from the Sky News echo chamber and hear a voice that's grounded in moral honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. So recently I connected to The Daily Show and I watched the video which I thought was really interesting between Brian Hart and Jon Stewart. It's really important to understand a different perspective, a perspective from two Jewish people. So Peter Beinart is Jewish. He's also heartbroken and angry about what's happening in Gaza, as are many of us. And unlike Chris Kenny, he's willing to say something deeply unpopular. Jews can be victims, and they can also be victimizers. And I'll play you a video now where he's talking about just that very fact.
It's true, because if you read the Hebrew Bible, if you read the Talmud, what you see is that our religious texts describe us in the...
I think this is quite instructive if you are actually interested in the Bible, and particularly, kind of like the Jewish version of the Bible, I guess. And he has some really interesting things to say about that if you are interested in biblical studies.
Full range of humanity. We're human beings. Nothing human is alien to us. We can be horribly victimized, and our texts talk about that. But the end of the book of Esther, from which the Purim story comes, also ends with a massacre by Jews of the Jews' enemies. The story of Hanukkah doesn't, and the story of the Chazmonaim, who became the Maccabees, became in power. It moves from them liberating the Jewish people to them becoming oppressors themselves. So part of recognizing us as human, as Jews, as fully human, is recognizing that we are capable of being victims and being victimizers, and we have to recognize that in order to prevent.
I think I just need to stop it there. I think that is a really important point. We're all capable, no matter who we are, Jews or otherwise, of seeing ourselves as victim or victimizers. It's a really interesting aspect of it all, and it certainly is part of, I think, what he's saying, which is the Jewish
us from falling into the trap of thinking that every single situation is the equivalent of what was happening in the Tsarist Russia or in Nazi Germany. Right. In some situations, the power dynamic is reversed. In Israel-Palestine, it's Jews who all enjoy legal supremacy and citizenship, and Palestinians who are denied basic rights. And we have to recognize that that's possible, and we have to fight against it for our own sake and for the sake of our honor.
I think there's some fantastic stuff in what Peter has to say, particularly at the end about fighting for, and they're not fighting just for their honour, they're fighting for everybody's honour. And that is that is something which I think someone like Kelly just fails to understand. He's got no concept of whatever about what any of that actually means. He talks about the need for a moral reckoning, about how Jewish tradition at its heart is about justice, not supremacy, not turning a blind eye when your side is the one doing harm. He's not denying Jewish history. He's not erasing the horrors Jews have faced. He's saying that history should make us more compassionate, not more brutal. Beinart wants the Jewish community, especially in America, to look in the mirror and see the moral damage being done by uncritical support for Israel's actions in Gaza. He's calling for empathy, not just for Israel, but for Palestinians. And that's powerful. Because it's easy to stand by your own when they're the victims. It's a hell of a lot harder to hold them accountable when they're the ones inflicting suffering. That's courage, and in my view, that's morality. So here's the contrast. Chris Kenny. Outrage for outrage's sake. Straw man arguments, fear-mongering, and an obsession with denying Palestinian legitimacy. I think it's woeful. Compared to Peter Beinart. Honesty, courage, a willingness to face uncomfortable truths because they matter more than scoring political points. And here's the question for all of us. Do we want leaders and commentators who shout the loudest, or the ones who speak the truth, even when it hurts? I'd be interested to know what your comments are around all of this, and if you found this conversation worth having, please hit the like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe. Subscribe to the Tony Tonkin Show. Because here I endeavour to deal with truth, not manufactured outrage.